Hello, so Stephanie?
Yes, you're live now, Michael.
Yes, okay. Now we are starting. Okay?
Yes, it started.
Yes, yes. So I'm very sad to do so, but I have to announce a change in this panel. We cannot do without expressing our sorrow for the absence of our colleague and friend, Eugenia Correa, who recently passed away. She should have been with us to present a paper together with Mario Seccareccia. Mario will remember her before his presentation. And now we can I think begin with the first presentation. The first presentation by, what happens here? There are two presenters, Bon-Woo Koo, Department of Sociology, Chung-Ang University, Republic of Korea, and Yoo-Hyoung Ji, Department of Sociology, Kyungnam University, Republic of Korea. The title of the presentation is Karl Polanyi's Theory of Fictitious Commodity and Cultural Political Economy of Institutions. Please, you can begin your presentation. Okay. It's okay. So Mario, it's to you.
Yeah, since they're not here yet, who knows what's happened? Maybe they're having a hard time accessing
do you?
Conference. I could go ahead if you wish. You know. Yeah.
Okay. But I already. Did you heard what I said before?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, okay. Oh, it's okay. Please, Mario.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my name is Mario Seccareccia. I'm from Canada, here from the University of Ottawa in Canada, and I was supposed to do a presentation, in fact, a paper with my colleague and good friend, old friend, Eugenia Correa, from UNAM in Mexico City. And we had originally intended to do a paper together. In fact, when I first contacted her about the idea of doing something for this conference, she was all too happy to participate and to join me, but at the time we were too busy. This was in December. We were too busy with other stuff. Indeed, I was preparing a paper for a presentation at the ASA meetings online at the AFI, the Association for Evolutionary Economics. And indeed, what I was working on then, I thought I could do an extension with Eugenia for this conference. So we had agreed to do that, and really started to work maybe in February. But unfortunately, she became very ill, and after a few weeks in the hospital, literally, she passed away. So in a sense, we have not been able to work together. Now, let me just get share my, if I could get this, okay. Let me just do this here, okay. So in fact, she never really worked on it with me because she was just too ill. And we just left. Initially, I thought I would just drop out because I wasn't sure what to do at the time. But I decided to go ahead and do something anyways. And I'm sure she would be happy that I would have done this, in that regards. And so in a sense, this presentation really is an homage to Eugenia. Who was a good friend of mine. I'd known her since the 1980s, literally, because we were both associated with an institute in Paris at the time, which was founded by François Pérou, called the Institut de Sciences Mathématiques et Économiques Appliquées. And over the years, we had some contact, but it was only over the last decade or so that we actually started to do some writing together, some research together. And we worked on about a half a dozen papers. And I'm just going to highlight one of them, which is this one here that actually goes back a little over 3 years ago, in January of 2018, when we received a prize for a paper that was published in one of the Association for Evolutionary Economics affiliated journals called the Forum for Social Economics, where we had published a paper titled Supranational Money and the Euro Crisis, Lessons from Karl Polanyi, which originated, in fact, at a presentation that we did in Buenos Aires in November of 2012. And Michele will perhaps remember that. And we received a prize because it was published in 2017 eventually. And we received a special recognition for that. And these were the better times where you will see Eugenia and myself, as well as two of the past presidents of the association who were present at that president's breakfast meeting at the time. And, Eugenia is really well known to a lot of the colleagues associated, especially with the Polanyi, the Polanyi Institute in Montreal, because she was became very close in a sense to Carrie Polanyi-Levitt, because she was the principal translator of a team that worked on her translation of Carrie's book from 2013. And it's really, last time Carrie and I and Eugenia actually worked together in Mexico was for the book launch in November of 2018. So in that regard, there's a strong association with the Institute. And it's truly, as I said, it's tragic what happened to her. I will not, go through the details of this, except to say that it's just a very sad and tragic story. Now, I would like to get to the, the actual paper that I would like to present. Actually, it's not written yet, but the ideas are there. It's in fact, as I indicated, it's really an offshoot of a related paper, which was broadly, focused on questions relating to the labor market and more specifically on full employment. And the paper is going to come out in June in the Journal of Economic Issues, in fact. So if anybody is interested, I could even send you a copy if you email me. But the purpose of this presentation is to, in a sense, build on what I was saying there, but going much further, especially to describe the Polanyian perspective on the so-called labor market and the commoditization of human relations. And also to emphasize, as we're going to see, in light of what has happened over this COVID crisis, okay, why, in fact, I've been pushing since the 1980s, at least, I've been writing about this. I've been pushing why it is extremely important that if we're going to go the route, which I think we must go at some point in terms of universal basic income and all that, that we should also remain committed to a principle of full employment. And I will try to explain why that is so important. However, before we get to the sort of policy sort of questions that I would like to, discuss somewhat, I do want to start with some quotes on, from Polanyi here, from his, obviously from his major work there, The Great Transformation. Quotes coming from chapter 6 primarily, but you have them also elsewhere, especially on the Spinam land system and all that. But this is from chapter 6 on the fictitious, commodities. And what he says, and I'm going to quote maybe the first one here, just to show what this is all about here. He, of course, argued that labor, land, and money are obviously not commodities. The postulate that anything that is bought and sold must have been produced for sale is emphatically untrue in regard to them. In other words, according to the empirical definition of a commodity, they are not commodities. Labor is only another name for a human activity which goes with life itself, which in its turn is not produced for sale, but for its entirely different reasons. Nor can that activity be detached from the rest of life, be stored or mobilized. Land is only another name for nature, which is not produced by man. Actual money, finally, is merely a token of purchasing power, which as a rule is not produced at all, but comes into being through the mechanism of banking or state finance. None of them is produced for sale. And the commodity description of land and labor is entirely fictitious. And then he goes on that. I won't even quote the second part here of what I have there. But, basically what he argues, the strategy for analyzing, the world, especially of the 19th century, was that in fact, what we see is that they're emerging in human relations, either in the form of credit-debt relations, which is where money originates, as he says, or vis-a-vis nature through evolving property rights, in terms of appropriation and disposition of land, especially. Polanyi described how each of these three fictitious commodities, starting with money and land, were commoditized, and with the last then being labor. In fact, Polanyi argues that, and I quote, that the market for labor was in effect the last of the markets to be organized under the new industrial system. And Polanyi accepts much of what Marx wrote about the emergence of a capitalist labor market when he points, say, to the effects of the enclosure movement, etc. I have a quote here where he, kind of referring to the enclosures and also to the consolidation and to compact holding, etc., which is the stuff that you will also find in Marx and Capital and so on. Now, as I've discussed elsewhere, while Polanyi felt that Marx was correct in describing the emerging capitalist labor market as analogous to what may be conceived as a kind of a lobster trap, he felt that Marx had ignored the institutional changes emerging from the late 18th and early 19th century Spinam system. Now, in his notes, and I won't even quote all that given the time constraint here, Polanyi basically argues that the Marx and Engels had missed out to some extent on criticizing the Spinam model, but you cannot really fault them for that, because they, by the time they were writing, it had already disappeared from the scene, and therefore what was focused in terms of their own attacks was the emerging post-1834 changes in the Poor Laws Amendment Act and all that went on at that time. And therefore, they seem to have missed out on something, as he says. Now, that last reference to the Spinam model really raises a thorny question that has been debated a great deal among Polanyi scholars. And this is because, in opposition to certain economic historians of the Industrial Revolution, Polanyi really stood on one side. He was critical of people like Clapham at Cambridge University at the time, and was subscribe to what he refers to in that quote that I have there, to the institutionalist approach to economic history, starting with Engels, Marx, and others, Montu, etc., on that list. And he, of course, criticized these other economic historians like Clapham for really not dealing with the Spinham-Land system as an institution, and just simply, really did not emphasize the importance of that. Well, for Polanyi instead, the really final development to the process of commoditization of labor resulted from what actually happened under the Spinham-Land system. Now, he argued, and I quote again, that the Spinham-Land law occupied a strategic position. And he argues here that actually it introduced no less a social and economic innovation than the right to live. And until abolished in 1834, it effectively prevented the establishment of a competitive labor market. So now, one will find a great deal of debate as to the significance of the Spinham-Land system. I've written stuff on that, but there are many others. I could just mention in here Block and Summers' book, which spends a whole chapter on that. And this has to do primarily with the implications of the Spinham-Land wage subsidy to maintain workers and their families on a subsistence income, and why the abolition of the right to live, as Polanyi refers to it, of Spinham-Land, was crucial to the development of a capitalist labor market. Hence, whether you find, let's say, whether for Polanyi or indeed Marx, what was central to their analysis was the historical necessity of setting up of institutional structures to create what I could call here a captive labor market, or a kind of lobster trap view of the labor market, meaning that, let's say, as Marx would say, let's in the case of Marx and the enclosure movement, for instance, that when you uproot the peasantry, they cannot go back to the land, and therefore you created the conditions for them to be, to become wage earners within this capitalistic structure. However, there are other aspects that they did somewhat de-emphasized. Okay. Indeed, as I was saying earlier, though, Polanyi focused on the Spinham-Land model and the wage subsidy effects that prevented the development of this capitalistic labor market. But there's another perspective out there, which, if you look at it historically, as long as you had, let's say, the rural or agricultural sector remained dominant until the mid to the late 19th century, let's say in the case of Western Europe and North America, this capitalist or captive labor market that permeated mostly these urban industrial enclaves, of manufacturing and so on, was in actual fact very porous. There was a lot of flow that went across. In fact, there's a whole literature going back to the classical writers that they highlighted, going back to whoever, Ricardo or etc., and even Marx, actually, which is ironic, which was further analyzed, by the time you get to the 20th century by development economists like, W.A. Lewis, for instance, in his famous 1954 article on unlimited supply of labor and all of that. The non-capitalist, quote unquote, what he calls traditional sector, let's say in the case of Lewis, remained a significant, what I would call escape route from unemployment in times of crisis afflicting the industrial sector. Hence, more than Spinham-Land, it was really the sheer size of the traditional agricultural sector which had a mitigating effect during slumps as repositories of these labor reserves for the industrial sector. And the evolution of capitalism since the Industrial Revolution is really characterized by the decline, of course, of this traditional escape route, what nowadays we would refer to in the development kind of literature as the informal sector. and the widespread extension of this captive labor market across the economy, the so-called formal sector, where you may have a primary and secondary labor market, let's say as studied by, by many institutional economists, for instance. But by the 20th century, as during the Great Depression, this led to really a lot of, rallying cries and so on in support of progressive right to a job in the form of full employment policy, as well as a right to life through a patchwork of social security programs put in place, especially after World War II, that would be a kind of substitute, in a sense, to the disappearance of that traditional sector that was the buffer earlier to the industrial sector when times of crisis would occur. Now, during the COVID-19 crisis, in most industrial countries, it was the right to life that got suddenly prioritized, since the appropriate response became one of what I would call here a programmed increase in the number of unemployed. You have to get these workers off the labor market if they're not, essential workers and all that. And of course, during the whole, from last year, from 2020, 2021 right now, it was achieved by an initial and then now periodic removal of workers from certain activities deemed to be of higher risk to spread the coronavirus in the non-essential sectors of the economy. Now, while all countries were impacted by the COVID-19 crisis, the policy response were not the same. One just has to look at the initial response in, let's say, in the US under Trump and Canada under Trudeau here. And lacking the informal sector to fall on, as was the case, say, in the 19th century, most countries in the industrialized world provided income support either directly to the individuals or households, or indirectly via transfers to businesses with the purpose of retaining workers, on their payroll. Many countries in emerging and developing countries also implemented lockdowns, even though it was hardly universal. As we know, I don't know, like Brazil, for instance, etc. The vast majority of these EDC countries provided little income support. Despite the income support, however, the labor market outcomes were not the same as can be seen, as I'll show you below now, starting with figure 1, when we look at the 3 North American countries, and then we look at the G7 countries, the industrial countries, and then I chose a selected group of countries of Latin America where I was able to get some information on that. So let me just start with the evolution, the unemployment rate here in the North American countries. If you look at this, my initial response was to say, well, this highlights the difference here. You got both, the blue line is Canada and the United States here. Their response was very similar. You had a huge jump in the unemployment rate where, we got to almost Great Depression levels of unemployment. But if you take a country like Mexico, well, it did in fact go up somewhat, but not very dramatically. And one would think, well, it's probably because the traditional informal sector being, again, the kind of buffer, to crisis in the industrial sector. Well, it's not quite true that. It's not that simple. In fact, as we're going to see in a minute, it's a lot more complicated. But my initial response was to think that way at the time. Back when I was writing that earlier article in the fall, I didn't have this information, as we're going to see in a minute. Now, before I do that, let me just show you in the case of the G7 countries, the so-called industrial countries here. Again, there's incredible varieties here. If you take Canada and the United States, which is one group here in a sense, okay, these are the high unemployment countries where it jumped up a great deal. Then you got the other extreme here is, take, let's say, Japan or even Germany or even the UK here. It's very mild increase, but not very dramatic at all. Then you got countries like Italy or France here, which again, what we see here is the actual opposite here. By the time you get March, April, you see that there was a decline in this case in the unemployment rate, not an increase. Now, So now what was happening there? Well, we'll get to that in a second as to what exactly was going on, because obviously it has to do with the institutions in place and how the response emerged as a result of the institutional structures of these countries. But let me first get to the others, because I'll take the case of Latin.
Mario, please, you have still 2 or 3 minutes, please.
Well, that's all I'll need. That's all I'll need, because I'm going to go through. I will look at Latin America. If you, I took 5 countries of Latin America for where I would get data, and you see, this is down here is of course Mexico, but then you got other countries where you have some fairly significant increases as well. Not as dramatic as Canada and the United States, but still very significant. Okay, so what was happening to the informal sector is the issue versus the formal sector. Well, again, it's not what was happened before. If I were to extend the data back to the, let's say, global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, you would have seen that, take a country like Mexico here, you would have seen that the actual informal sector grew as a result of the crisis. So what was going on was exactly what we saw in the 19th century as well, which is that it was playing that buffer, for the industrial sector crises. But now, the only country that was still doing that was, as you could see here, this is Peru. Now, there are particularities that we could get to Peru as to why that was going on, but the vast majority of them, in fact, was no longer the case. So here's a situation that looks more and more like the lobster trap scenario. I also have here participation rates, which is important, but all of them suffered a dramatic decline in this participation rate. And yet you had a huge increase in the official unemployment rate in these countries. So once again, there is a dramatic change. Now, what this does basically is reveals both the vulnerabilities, as I argue, of the current system, but most importantly, also the differences in unemployment outcomes that have largely to do, as I said, with both the institutions in place and the way the state or government formulated their response. Now, in the emerging countries, what you find in many of these developing countries is the fact that first, there was very little macroeconomic intervention. These were practically non-existent compared to the industrial countries. And so was the income support that was lacking. And indeed, what we would have thought that this would have played a kind of shock absorbing role, in the case of the informal sector, as it did, let's say, for the industrial countries in the 19th century, but that was not the case. And what I wish to argue here is that those countries right now, let's say the example of Latin America, where in fact they're behaving more and more like the industrial countries' behavior, which is that the lobster trap scenario became dominant during this crisis. And this more than ever highlights the need for a universal basic income that should be put in place to not only provide a right to a job, which is critical, but also a right to live, which was indeed the issue that arose, as I said, going back to Spinamland. And as Polanyi's analysis of the Spinamland system really teaches us, a perverse neoliberal form of guaranteed income, as promoted historically by the likes of Friedman, Hayek, or even Stigler, Keynesian-type full employment policy would have terrible negative consequences. So both are important. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mario. It was a very interesting presentation, and we will be able to read also the article coming out in the Journal of Economic Issues, #2 of this year. There was a very interesting historical considerations and comparison with all the difference. And I would like very much to continue this discussion with you. Now, So we continue with the presentation by Bon Hu, and I already told about him. Minimal notice at the beginning. Is coming from the University of Chung in Korea, and the title of the presentation is Karl Polanyi's Theory of Fictitious Commodity and Cultural Political Economy of Institutions. Please, you can begin your presentation.
Michele,
Yes.
Bonhunku asked if we can change the order of presentation. So if Geoff is available to jump into the presentation, he would prefer to go last.
Yes, I don't know what happens. Maybe my computer has some problem. Oh.
So Geoff, are you able to present?
Absolutely, no problem at all. I can jump straight in now.
Do you hear me? I restart in some way. No, okay. Okay. Now I can see. Do you see me? Do you hear me?
I can see you, Michele, yeah, and I can hear you. I'm absolutely fine. I can take over and present now, no problem at all.
Okay.
Would you like me to go ahead?
Yes. No.
Wonderful. Okay, let me get started then. I'm
sorry, something happened with my computer. I thought that it was okay. So we begin with Geoff Goodwin now. Now I'm asking because there was also Bon Wuku was arrived and it was listed before.
I think that's absolutely fine. I can step in now and they can present last. I can take over, Michele.
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd like to express my condolences to hear about the terrible news about Eugenia. I wasn't aware of that before I joined the panel, so I'd like to express my condolences to Mario and also to her family. And that's a really awful news. And so that's the first thing I'd like to say. Secondly, I would like to apologise because I've not had very long to prepare for my presentation. I have a job interview tomorrow morning, and I'm had to devote more time to that. And I know there is an irony, given Polanyi's attention to the commodification of labour, and I'm thinking about how I'm commodifying my own labour power. But I've had to prioritise that. So what I will present is really a very sort of loose outline, some initial thoughts that I've collected based on some published work, and really sort of opening up, I hope, to a sort of conversation and a discussion about decommodification. And I think there are some crossover with my work and with Mario's presentation. I haven't had a chance to time my presentation, so please stop me if I'm talking for too long, and I can wrap things up, and we can bring up some other points in the discussion. Okay, well, my name is Geoff Goodwin, and I teach in the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'm very pleased and proud to be presenting here today because I presented, well, actually physically in Montreal in 2008 at the Karl Polanyi conference when I was just starting my PhD, and I finished my PhD 4 or 5 years ago, which drew very heavily on Karl Polanyi's work. So it's a real pleasure to be back here, even if I'm not physically in Montreal at Concordia University. Okay, so my talk is broken down into 4 parts. I'll start by just talking a little bit about decommodification and the role it plays in the double movement, at least the way conceptualize and theorize the double movement. And then I would like to give some insight into how I'm sort of trying to conceptualize and think about decommodification based on some initial work that I've done in that area. I'll move on then to think a little bit about decommodification during the pandemic, and again, there are some parallels here with Mario's presentation. And if I have time, then I'll just say some very tentative sort of brief comments on possible sort of post-pandemic. I mean, I think in fact it's really perhaps a bit naive to be talking about post-pandemic trajectories, but trajectories looking forward as we hopefully move out of the crisis, the public health crisis at least. Okay, so the role that decommodification plays in the double movement, I conceptualize the double movement, which of course is one of Polanyi's key concepts that he outlines in The Great Transformation to understand the collapse of liberal capitalism and the great transformation that he saw happening in the 1930s, which of course took progressive and also regressive forms. And I conceptualize Polanyi's double movement as a simultaneous process of commodification and decommodification. So we have these two sides, the movement and the counter movement, happening simultaneously. So my reading differs to some readings of a double movement which see the process as a sequential process. We have, first we get the movement towards the market, and then we have a counter movement. I conceptualize it in a more dialectical way and thinking about how these processes take place at the same time. And see this as a fundamental contradiction in capitalism. So I don't see it as something that's confined just to, let's say, neoliberalism. And of course, as we've heard already, we've heard there's a story about the fictitious commodities, at least mainly in relation to labour. And the dynamics of a double movement really centre on fictitious commodities and fictitious commodification as a process. And Polanyi argued, of course, that these are not genuine commodities and they operate according to a different logic to what we might call genuine commodities. And Polanyi's critique was, of course, partly moral. He was very much opposed to a commodification of labour and land. And of course, by land, he was really referring to nature and the environment more broadly. But he also, of course, highlighted some of the interesting dynamics that happen when land and labour is commodified, and the role of the state in intervening in those markets and creating those markets, and then how those processes are contested. And that, I think, really gives the double movement its dynamics. And then the way at least I sort of think about a double movement is really as a plurality of movements, as multiple double movements. So rather than thinking about a unitary movement towards and against the market, let's say, I think more about smaller scale double movements that are happening again simultaneously. So we can then use the double movement to think about how processes of commodification and decommodification are happening within distinct spheres of the economy and involve particular social classes and particular social groups. These, of course, might combine into a kind of transformative moment, but there's an awful lot of double movement activity, I think, happening below the surface, if you like, if we use sort of Polanyi's macro sort of grand theory approach. So I've developed some of these ideas in a paper that I published in Development and Change in 2018. And in that paper, I've sort of taken some initial steps to thinking about decommodification. And of course, Polanyi himself didn't use this term. He tended to use protectionism more. And I think there's a number of problems with that term. And I've argued that we should, and this is not something particularly novel, Gareth Bale and other maybe scholars who have critically engaged with Polanyi's work have made this point, but I argue that we need to sort of move away from thinking about protectionism and then to decommodification. And then, of course, we need to think about what decommodification means and try to conceptualize it in a sort of rigorous and interesting way. And I've only taken some initial steps in that direction in this paper, and I'll talk about those in a moment. So again, I see decommodification centering on fictitious commodification, so really focusing on land broadly defined and labour in particular, which Polanyi really emphasised and singled out, although of course money and finance was also fundamental to his argument and his thinking. So I understand decommodification as a gradational process, not as a binary process. So I don't think of something as being commodified or decommodified. I think about different levels of commodification, and I think decommodification helps us understand some of those levels and why they can create problems and can also have some positive outcomes. And decommodification is not only achieved through the state, so it can be achieved through the state, with the state, or outside of the state. And that's, I think, an important point. Polanyi himself, of course, pointed towards this in terms of trade unions and labour cooperatives and so on and so forth. But I think it's important that we recognise that the state is just one actor in this process, and it's important, I think, when we think about what's happening today. I understand decommodification as a result of the counter-movements or counter-movement activity, historical counter-movement activity and contemporary counter-movement activity. And again, Polanyi tended to sometimes conflate the terms protectionism and counter-movement, and I think there's some ambiguity in his analysis there. So I've tried to sort of move towards a slightly more rigorous, perhaps, way of understanding those processes, which are connected but distinct, analytically distinct. And in my paper, I've argued that we need to think about counter movements as being offensive as well as defensive. So much of the Polanyian literature, certainly not all of it, but much of the Polanyian literature tends to think of contemporary counter movements as defensive responses to the breakdown in particular political economic regimes. And of course, I think that is part of the story, but at the same time, I argue that counter movements have an offensive capacity in the sense that they are able to create and transform as well as protect and reform. And that I think helps us move beyond a more sort of reformist sort of reading of Polanyi, often referred to as a kind of soft reading of Polanyi in the Polanyian literature. And I should say that my research, empirically, I've looked at these movements in Ecuador and Latin America primarily. So I think that when we think about a counter movement, it of course isn't something that's automatic. It's something that's socially and politically constructed, and it has to be explored empirically. And I've done that in Ecuador mainly by looking at indigenous movements in the highland region of the country. Okay, so in this paper, I set out 3 different forms of decommodification, and I'm really sort of thinking about these, and I'm developing my work on decommodification, but I'm really thinking about these as sort of provisional forms of decommodification, some initial ideas rather than anything definitive. So one form of decommodification, I argue, is we might call intervening. So this is where we see direct state intervention in markets for fictitious commodities. So examples of those policies might be minimum wages, food price regulation, and rent control. So where we see direct state intervention in markets. Then we have what I call limiting forms of decommodification. So these are sort of supplementary mechanisms or institutions that limit exposure to markets, limit the extent to which certain groups, social classes and groups are exposed to the operation of the market, and particularly the price mechanism and supply and demand mechanism. And examples of those might be social security, housing benefit, and food stamps, for example. And then we have what we could consider to be a more radical, muscular form, perhaps, of decommodification, preventing and reversing. So this is where mechanism, institutions, practices are really aimed towards, as I say, preventing or reversing fictitious commodification. So examples of these might not be particularly radical. Public parks, for example, might be one example. Communal water systems, which is something that I've researched in Ecuador and Colombia, and squatting, for example, might be another form of sort of direct action, the way that people are taking control of housing and land. And again, so this can happen outside of the state or through the state or with the state. Okay, so I'm going to use these 3 categories to think a little bit about some of the decommodification activity we've seen during the pandemic. Before I do so, just some sort of initial quick comments about them. First of all, that I see them as relational in the sense that they involve and create distinct social and political and ecological relations. So we can't sort of simplify, we can't think about them, of course, simply as policies or laws. There's something much bigger than that, and we need to analyze and think about what kind of relations are being created through these different types of institutions and activities and practices. I've started to think more about the link between precarity and decommodification. So I'm starting to see sort of decommodification as linked to precarity that's created by fictitious commodification. And there I'm thinking more about precarity as a condition rather than a class. You know, the idea of a precariat, for example, which I find a bit problematic. I think I'm more inspired by the work of Anna Singh, who sort of thinks about precarity as perhaps the defining condition of our times. And she wrote, you know, her book on that long before the pandemic hit, and I think it has renewed importance today. So I think thinking about how decommodification and precarity link are interesting and important. And then I understand decommodification generally as a contradictory process, so it can actually support commodification and capital accumulation as well as undermine it. And I think that's why thinking about different forms of decommodification is useful, because it gives us a sense of how it connects to and potentially challenges or supports capitalism as a form of economic organization. Okay, let me just say then a few words about the kind of decommodification we've seen, the kind of responses that have taken place during the pandemic. And of course, these are very general, broad comments. I don't have any of the data that Mario has, unfortunately. So I'm just really throwing some ideas out there based on my own sort of observations. So I think that perhaps one of the most important points and a sort of vindication, if you like, of Polanyi in many ways, and certainly his argument that markets and states that co-constitute and co-evolve has been the level of state intervention. You know, that although of course the degree and form of state intervention has been contested, governments from across the political spectrum have intervened in markets, and often in quite significant ways, to limit the fallout from the pandemic. There's been very few, of course there have been some, but very few serious calls for a kind of Schumpeterian, creative destruction response, or Hayekian kind of response, which would, really try to limit any state intervention at all. So I think that to some extent, some of Polanyi's central ideas have been sort of vindicated, of course, by the crisis, on a much bigger scale, of course, than what we've seen in the 2008 financial crisis. As far as I understand it, and again, I'm talking in very general terms, then most of this state intervention has sort of fallen into what we might think about as a less radical forms of decommodification. So intervening, rent controls, of course, paying the wages of workers in some cases, which is what's been happening in the United Kingdom since last March, where a right-wing government has been paying the wages of workers directly. And then at the same time, we've seen sort of limiting forms, supplementary forms of decommodification, perhaps cash transfers, direct cash transfers, unemployment benefits, and those types of institutions, those types of policies have been activated or reactivated or amplified during the pandemic. And that to some extent comes back, I think, to Mario's point about the right to life. So again, connecting perhaps to Mario's point about, of course, all of this has been shaped really by existing and historical practices and relations and institutions that were already in place. And these, if we think about them from a Polanyian perspective, are the outcomes of contemporary, of historical counter-movement activity. So it's important, I think, to think about how different historical experiences have shaped contemporary outcomes. And it would be interesting to sort of map that onto Mario's chart of different labour outcomes in North America and Latin America. Okay, so I think...
Please, you have 2-3 minutes maximum.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, I'll be done in a minute or two. So I think what we might think about sort of geographies of decommodification, there's been huge variation in state intervention across the global north and across the global south. Thinking about, let's say, Britain in comparison to Ecuador, which is the country that I know best in Latin America, then there's no comparison in terms of the way that the state has intervened. Of course, the British state has a enormous fiscal potential in relation, and fiscal and bureaucratic potential in relation to the Ecuadorian state. And that's particularly so because during the pandemic, the Ecuadorian government, the outgoing Ecuadorian government was sort of well into a process of fiscal consolidation and austerity, which was overseen by the IMF. So when the pandemic hit, the country was on its knees already. So we see huge variation, of course, and I would argue the sort of contemporary relevance of centre-periphery structures and relations and colonial legacies, of course, are very much being played out when we think about how we understand the degree of intervention across the globe. So I think we see in many ways, and again, this is certainly not universal, but the limits of state decommodification in the global south, and generally, of course, this has been reduced under neoliberalism, but of course that has much longer historical roots, where labour was never, fully anywhere near sort of decommodified to the same extent as it was in the global north in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, for example. Very truncated welfare regimes only incorporated a relatively small section of workers. So these are much longer historically rooted issues. And then we have non-state forms of decommodification, which have been really interesting and perhaps most interesting in from my perspective, that have been very diverse across very different, in very different contexts. So community water systems, again, which is something that I've been researching in Ecuador.
I'm sorry. We have another speaker there. If you try to close.
Yeah, I'll finish, Michele. Yeah, with this one slide, and then I'll yeah, no problem. And I think to some extent, at least, these are sort of rooted in more significant and potentially radical forms of decommodification. This idea of preventing and reversing, but they also show the potential, I think, of community organisations, of social movements, of playing this sort of limiting role in decommodification, it not being something that's totally reliant on the state. And I think as we look forward, then I think thinking about non-state forms of decommodification and how they interact with the state will be particularly interesting and important. And I'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Sorry for overdoing my time.
Yes, thank you, Geoff. Now we have the last presentation by Bon Vuku, isn't it? Is he there? Hello?
Bon Vuku, are you able to show your camera and mics?
Hello?
And we also want to
hello.
inform you that Joo-Hyoung is also there.
Yeah, I'm a co-presenter.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's to you now, please. Sorry, I have already presented you before. Now you can begin your presentation, please.
Yeah.
Do you hear me? Did you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry for coming late. I was confused about the exact time of this session, and yeah. So we are going to talk about Karl Polanyi's theory of fictitious commodification as a cultural political economy of institutionalization. So we try to reinterpret Polanyi's theory of fictitious commodification based on his earlier theoretical concepts from the socialist calculation debate. And by doing so, we will disclose the hidden theoretical structure of cultural political economy in Polanyi's thought. So we are going to interpret Polanyi as an original cultural political economist with contemporary relevance for the analysis of capitalism as a symbolic system, by which we mean the particular accounting system. So cultural political economy combines critical semiotic analysis and critical political economy, And like Polanyi, it critiques the naturalness of economic structure, and it contrasts the actually existing economies with economic imaginaries. Geoff and some argue that Karl Polanyi is the pioneering cultural political economist who explored the role of language and performative effects of liberal economic imaginary on the liberal market economy. We build on the interpretation, but will more concretely show how Polanyi explains the way in which the capitalist market economy works through its own symbolic systems and its own interpretation. Karl Polanyi is a kind of symbolic institutionalist. He considers the economy as an institutive process, which is institutionalized interaction. So the actual interaction is consisted or consists of various activities and elements that exist as an organic whole. And but it needs to be institutionalized, and there's a process that creates a regularized interdependence between economic activities and elements according to a rule. So to Polanyi, what actually exists is mere fixing of human and non-human movements, but through institutionalization, we gave name them like labor and capital, crafting unions, lacking speeding, the spread of risk. And so, are the semantic units of social context. So institutionalization involves semantics, which is a symbolic process. We will look at how Polanyi talk about the articulation between economic facts, accounting concept, and economic theories in his socialist accounting. Polanyi says that accounting is the key problem of socialist economy, but he implies that also that the central institutional symbolic discussive foundation of the capitalist economy is actually the accounting. This system is indeed composed of three levels: economic facts, accounting concepts, and economic theories, which are interrelated, but they are very independent. The economic facts is something like harvest, which is not yet interpreted by accounting concept, but it can it is transformed into accounting concept through accounting system, like the physiocrat's notion of net product, or Keynes' concept of surplus value. These are Polanyi's own example, but these accounting concepts are also related to particular economic theories, which is the third order phenomena that relate to accounting concepts to particular purpose, such as profit. So physiocrats develops their own theory, capital and value, and so they consider capital a means of production and the agriculture as the source of value. Then how do they relate to each other and construct a capitalist market system? Here we resort to John Searle's discussion on the social construction of reality. He argues that X counts as Y in context of C. So it is C that makes X Y. So the C context is particular rules and systems. So institutional fact is constructed in this way. There's a brute fact which is not yet institutionalized, but it becomes an institutional fact by virtue of being in the system S. And this fact X counts as a function F in the system S2. And likewise, construction of institutional form norm takes in this way, takes this form. So an idea or an imaginary establishes an institutional norm Y in the system S, and institutional norm Y counts as the goal G in the system S. This, if we apply this scheme to institutionalization of economic facts and norms, it's like this. Brute economic fact, for example, obligations and liabilities becomes an institutional fact X, which includes debts or invested assets, when it performs a function, for example, financial instrument as a source of profit in and through the capitalistic accounting system. So this is the way the economic fact is constructed. And the economic norm is constructed in this way. An economic idea, for example, the prices is a function of demand and supply. This idea establishes an institutional norm Y. Asset value should be measured by current price or market value. When it serves or justifies a capitalist goal of capital accumulation through financial instruments in and through the capitalist accounting economy. For example, market accounting or fair value market accounting, which measures values in current prices terms. So this is the picture that shows the triad of economic facts, accounting concept, and economic theory. So accounting concepts transform brute facts into institutional facts, and the accounting concept is established as institutional norms through particular economic theory backed by particular imaginaries. Now, let me state what cultural political economy is in this sense. So it started from the assumption that the world is complex and chaotic. So it needs to be reduced. So particular systems and institutions are created to cope with and reduce the complexity. And this system actually makes institutional fact and institutional norms. So, and then the systems and institutions are created, selected, and developed through what we call social and political processes that include semiotic, symbolic, discursive, and material practices. And then these systems are inevitably partial, and so it increases the gap between the systems and institutions and the world. So there appear inevitable crisis tendencies and counter crisis tendencies. So we interpret Polanyi's theory in these terms. So Polanyi considered the world an organic whole, but a system of market order, including capitalist accounting and the self-regulating market, is created, selected, and developed out of this organic whole, particularly in the 19th century. And in this, and through this system, particularly the capitalist accounting system, some brute facts, some brute economic facts.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, please. We have only 10 minutes before the closing of the section. If you can synthesize and arrive at a conclusion, please.
So labor and then money becomes commodities in this process, and the location of movement and combination of goods becomes production, and they are considered as factors of production, as a source of profit. And there's the idea, a liberal idea, established the institutional norms of profit as legitimate income. Okay, then this figure emerges out of our interpretation. So this is the system at the heart of 19th century civilization. So, and then, we skip this. So, there was many acts that supported the process. And this the systems institutions are inevitably partial and led to increasing gap between the systems institutions and the real world or realities of society. That's where the self-reflection of society begins. So we conclude that Polanyi's analysis of the triad of economic facts, accounting concepts, and economic theories, and its resultant fictitious commodification, criticizes the symbolic and artificial basis of the capitalist market system. And Polanyi is neither a simple institutionalist nor merely a precursor of CPE, cultural political economy, but an original and genuine cultural political economist who we can learn still much from. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you. And now I think we have only. It was very interesting your presentation. In fact, the idea of an institutional method is intrinsic in Polanyi thought, and he met the United States colleagues and scholars who agreed with him on this point. And I think a kind of original or classic institutionalism, because the problem is that there are presently new kinds of neo-institutionalism or neo-institutionalism, that try to forget the original inspiration of the institutionalism, that is, understand the organization of a society as a whole, and in its specificity as to other kind of societies. Now, I don't know if we have still 7 minutes for questions. I don't know if there is any question from the public. No question. So I don't know if may I myself to echo. There is a Mario. Mario, please. Please.
I just have a comment on our colleagues from Joo-Hyoung G and the other colleague. I'm sorry, I forgot the name now. But Boo-Won Koo, yes. What you're saying, I mean, Veblen, okay, who I'm sure Polanyi was somewhat familiar with. I mean, this is what Michele is saying here about other institutionalists at the time of when Polanyi was around. Veblen had already gone, passed some, what is it, maybe 2 decades earlier. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when he defined institutions, these were habits of thought and language. And in that regard, it is exactly what you're calling, cultural political economy. I mean, I'm just saying you're using other terms to say the same thing almost, It's ironic that you have not mentioned much about, these Veblen type institutionalists, what Michele refers to as the classical institutionalists, because obviously they would, they would very much agree with you, I think.
Yeah. Yes, Veblen was a cultural political economist. In this sense, probably we can study about him as a cultural political economist too. But in this paper, we focused on Karl Polanyi, and especially we were interested in the accounting system as the core, key, foundational category of the capitalist system. Because without capitalist system, with this capitalist accounting system, the profits and all the categories that constitute the capitalism would not exist. So this is very fundamental. So in this sense, we actually, probably our interpretation follows a Weberian line as well, because Max Weber considers rational accounting as a fundamental basis.
Thorsten Veblen, not Max Weber. Okay,
I know,
not just to correct you.
Yeah, but the point of the presentation is actually to show that how we can use Karl Polanyi's understanding of the articulation or nexus between economic facts, accounting concepts, and economic theories. So, so there are many other elements of cultural political economy in Polanyi, but the point was there because the key theory of fictitious commodification can be understood probably slightly differently or better when we use this framework, because so land, money, and labor are not merely commodities, but they are commodities in when we particularly look at them through this particular accounting system. You understand?
Yes, I understand, but I don't even agree with you. Money is not a commodity at all. It's balance sheet operation.
Yes, balance sheet operation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's not a commodity. It appears time when the banks issue a loan, whatever, and there's a counterparty to that, which is the deposits and all that. So that's what it's a relation.
It's a relation. So
and debtor.
That's why they are
not even commodities. Not the coins in our pocket.
Michele, I have a question from Arman that maybe I should answer before we close the panel in the chat. Should I go ahead and answer that question? Yeah, Arman, I think, thank you for the question. Absolutely. So I think during the pandemic, we've seen.
Okay.
Yeah. During the pandemic, we've seen, this sort of, if we think about it as a double movement, then the state, of course, plays a dual role within that process. It has the capacity to decommodify and commodify. And I think what we've seen during the pandemic is sort of, to some extent, vindicates the way I'm understanding the double movement as a simultaneous process. So on the one hand, we've seen states decommodifying. On the other hand, we've seen them commodifying, and that's been happening at the same time. So absolutely. So in the case of India, then of course the state and local and regional governments have played a huge role in terms of commodifying land and labour, and that has a longer term trajectory, of course, special economic zones and those sorts of things where states intervene to redistribute land to capitalists and commodify it through those sorts of practices. So I think you're absolutely right to sort of highlight the fact that the states have been very active in terms of, we're talking here about capitalist states that of course have been very active in commodifying while also decommodifying, and that's a very important point.
Yes, in fact, the problem is after 1.5 centuries of decommodification, nothing should be commodified, but the contrary is true. I don't know. It's difficult to explain this. You made a very interesting sociological, methodological analysis of the concept. This can be very useful, but there is also a problem of situating historically the problem of the double movement, and Polanyi in the Great Transformation is always very, very precise and with strict reference to historical reality when he speaks of double movement. There are also different phases. Beginning with the Cartist movement to the problem of the Great Depression of the last decades of the 19th century, the problem of imperialism, the problem of protectionism, the problem of the gold standard, always with precise historical references. And I think personally that the better thing is to follow the same method and make reference, always make reference to historical and factual realities. Now, for instance, the problem of the pandemic, and with for instance, but I think we must close because it's time. I thank you very much. I beg your pardon for having been, I think, not very efficient, to say the least. To say the least.
Beautiful.
And bye-bye. Thank you, and I hope to meet or remain in touch with you in the future. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Pleasure to meet you all. Thank you.
Take care. All the best.